So welcome, everybody. I know this is a topic that touches us all very, very deeply. And we were just saying beforehand that we are looking at the barriers to funding specifically for women-run organizations and women-focused organizations. But I think we could say the same for barriers for refugee communities. So I think it's really the funding issue is one that we need to look at, and we really thank Oxfam, who came to us with a report and said, "Can we do something about this? Can we present and have a discussion around this?" So thank you so much for the report that was done by Oxfam and IG advisors. I'm Atalanti Moquette, for those who don't know me, and founder of Giving Women. I think we've got a lot of people online. I saw we have somebody even from sunny Mauritius. So that's the extent. We have somebody from Beijing. So we are really reaching a large audience. Giving Women is an organization that's Swiss-based. It's a membership organization made up of about 150 women who are supporting projects directed at women and girls. The idea is that we do not give money, we give our expertise, our knowledge, our time to help organizations that are working on the ground, medium to small organizations that are working to support women and girls in the most vulnerable communities. We have a series of panels because we see ourselves as creating a kind of ecosystem where we can come together, UN organizations, large international NGOs, smaller grassroots organizations, civil society, to really have very important conversations together and have calls to action where we can really make a significant decision, changes as in collaboration with each other. And I repeat very often now, when we first started, I used to talk about the power of one and that we each have the power to make a difference. But today we've moved on and we say, we really believe in the power of one, but the magic of many. And I think this is an example of the magic of many. I'm going to pass on now to Katarina Wickramas.
Katarina's good.
Who is a good friend, an incredible energy powerhouse who has been working in the area of women for a long time, starting with women, refugee women, and moving on and really working with women's movements to really make systemic change for women all over the world. We are very, very honored that Katarina accepts to moderate for us very often, and it's always so much fun and such a great learning experience. So Katarina, thank you again, and thank you. I'll take this opportunity to thank all our panel for the time they have given, because this is, this is not a 1.5 hour event. This requires a lot of preparation. And I'd like to thank them very, very much for their time that they've given. So I pass on to Katarina. Thank you also, Katarina.
Thank you very much, Atalanti. It's always great fun to be part of these panels, challenging and thought-provoking. And I know all of you are joining us today because you feel exactly the same way. Before we begin, I just want to recognise the tragic and terrifying events underway in Ukraine. Many of us woke up this morning to the news of the hostilities. Some of us work with and support partners in the Ukraine and the region. I spoke to a colleague in Kiev this morning. She's the director of the Ukrainian Women's Fund, and they're mobilising humanitarian support as well as working towards dialogue for peace and democracy. The region might become a focus for our collective work, so I did want to start by joining together with them in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and the region, and in our hopes for a peaceful resolution.
Thank you, Katarina. That's amazing. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And today we're joined by a great lineup of panelists, as Atalante said, that are speaking to you from the UK, Liberia, Cambodia, South Africa, and Switzerland. And I feel very privileged as we've had the pleasure of chatting to the panel. I've had the pleasure of chatting to the panelists before today. And I can tell you they bring passion and knowledge, experience, and a revolutionary spirit to today's panel. So we're in for a treat. And I think that the breadth of where they come from reflects the breadth of where you are joining us from too. So I'm guessing that many of you will have had a chance to read the report that we're looking at today, A Leap of Faith, written by Oxfam and IG advisors. But just to get us started, I did ask Danny Srikandaraja, the CEO of Oxfam GB, to start by introducing us to the findings and really to his take on the findings. I'm not going to give you Danny's incredibly impressive CV or bio, because time is short and Google knows everything. So if you would like to learn more, you know exactly how to do that. So I'm going to start by handing to you, Danny, to just give us your impressions of the report. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katerina. And hi, everyone. Google knows too much, in my view, I'm afraid. But thank you for agreeing to host this event and to giving Women Atlantic and others as well. I do feel like a bit of an imposter because I had nothing to do with the writing of this report, and I just wanted to say that the report that I'm going to talk about is co-authored by a few Oxfam colleagues, Katie Sills, Tilly Peacock, and Joy Reddy, along with Alicia Miranda from IG Advisors. And they were responsible for the work. I'm just here to present, and I hope I do it justice. I also feel like an imposter because many of you, I suspect all of you, and some of whom I know, are very familiar, very intimately familiar with the issues and challenges that we're going to be discussing today. You know, it is such a frustration that here we are in 2022, and despite pledge after pledge by donor after donor to get more resources more directly, more empoweringly to women's organizations, we're far from meeting those pledges internally or as a sector. And for me, it's a real shame because unlocking funding or breaking the barriers to the funding of women's organization holds the key to so many other challenges that we're also trying to seek, right? Whether that's devolving power to local actors, whether that's building a more resilient civil society closer to the ground, whether that's about really shifting power and changing systems, or whether it's about rethinking how accountability works in the sectors we work in. And I could go on. There's so many things that would be well served if we do break the barriers to funding women's organizations. And so I think this is such a topical issue, not just in itself, but I think for the wider implications. I just wanted to run through a few slides based on the report, which I hope you can now see. So the report is called A Leap of Faith, and it's called A Leap of Faith. I'm going to go straight to this because of this quote that came up during the research. And as you will have seen, the research involved interviews and conversations, focus groups with a bunch of people, from donors, trusts and foundations, to women's rights activists and organization representatives. And the one that stood out to our colleagues was, when you talk about gender justice, the funder has to take a leap of faith. They have to buy into an agenda of freedom and emancipation, transformation and equality. If they say they buy into that, then they have to suspend their primal urge of, what do I get for my $25,000? And I suspect all of us who've worked in donors or been associated with donors, or all of us who've been consumers of philanthropy, are all too familiar with that question that seems to dominate the way things are. And so the report was called Leap of Faith because we thought that captured this sort of frustration, if you will, that lies at the heart of this work. The research identified many obstacles. I think three that are worth just sort of highlighting, I hope, to set the scene for this discussion. One is around the unequal power relations, particularly between donor and grantee, but also between smaller organizations and larger ones, between those organizations or networks that specialize in women's rights and others that that do other bits of social change or social progress. And we have to recognize that this inequality exists, and perhaps it would be naive to think that you could do away with it all. But I think we can do much better at recognizing and openly challenging some of the inequality of power inside inside these relationships. And it'd be great to come out of this call today with some insights and recommendations about how we all might better do that. Secondly, was around the sort of inflexibility of funding, and I think this is happening across sort of progressive funding, I suspect, especially in the development or humanitarian sector, where we're seeing ever more conditionality, sometimes in the guise of assurance or compliance, sometimes because we've created so many complex chains in the funding mechanism that by the time the subgrant of the subgrant gets to the final recipient, there's sort of, it's so inflexible. And so, money might trickle down, but power doesn't, and certainly flexibility doesn't either. And thirdly, this obstacle around demanding and impractical impact measurements. And impact, I suspect we've all seen it, has become a buzzword in many ways, but it's also a really important thing in all that we do. We all want to have impact, and that's really important that we focus on it, we measure it where we can, we show off about it where we can, and we confess where we can't make it as well as we had hoped. But I think what we heard in this research is that has also led to a sort of oppressive set of implications around, very narrow and impractical measures that miss out on so much of the wider change, the systemic change, the long-term change, the cultural change that many women's organizations are working towards. And so we do need to rethink what are those impact measurements that we need to serve us well in years to come. A few polarities, if you will, that came out in the research. One was around the motivations that donors had when they supported women's organizations. And I suppose these are all reductive and a bit crude, but I hope they help to illustrate the point. And there was a polarity between donors who saw their support for women's organizations as being, fundamentally about rights. And, this is funding as a good in itself, that it's important to fund women's rights, women's organizations, and donors sort of lean into that. But there are many other donors, perhaps more donors relatively, who see it as a more instrumental thing, that funding women's rights organization will help them do other things they're ultimately about. And we can have a conversation about whether that's a right or wrong, but it was an interesting sort of tension that colleagues unearthed, we think, in the research. Secondly, around power, and this, I've already talked a bit about this, that this sort of tension between the need for control, particularly for the donor to have the assurance mechanisms, the reports, the accountability, which drives against this desire to collaborate, to genuinely work together, whether that's between the donor and the recipient, or between multiple actors, including several recipients who, in a traditional sense we might end up having them compete with each other for the same pots of money, and we don't drive towards collaboration and genuine collaboration in the ecosystem. And thirdly, and again, I've talked about this already a bit, this sort of tension between quality funding, core funding, flexible funding, long-term funding, which seems to pull against this notion of wanting to have impacts. That we projectize our work and then we say, tell us the measures that you're going to deliver through this project over this time frame. And that is in clear tension with the sort of long-term systemic change that we want to get, and the quality funding that is likely or more likely to deliver that. What can we do? You should probably read the report because it'll give you a much better sense. But in very brief summary, here are 9 things that came out of the work around what could happen. I thought I might just pull out a couple just to say, One is this space and funding to plan and be creative. And, I've spent my entire career working in civil society as a consumer of funding, particularly from trust and foundation. And, the most precious, the sort of gold dust of funding, certainly in my experience, has been that which has been truly flexible. It gives you, that comes in early in the process, which even, resources your ability to plan and be creative. And rather than, you invest a lot of your time, you rush, you see whether you can meet the donor's requirements, you fill out the form, you make a whole bunch of compromises, and then you hope, you hold your fingers crossed to hope that you get the resources. Whereas, I think clearly there's a recommendation here around how do we nurture the full pipeline, if you will, of the creative process that we need to nurture and support in the organizations that we're reporting. And then all the way almost to the bottom there, I just thought it might be useful to pull out a couple there. One is around taking responsibility for shifting power. And I think there is, this is a very live conversation, I suspect, in many organizations. I can tell you it's very live in Oxfam. We're a large confederated international NGO, but which is still very Northern dominated. We are built with a structure because of our history that tends to, resources and decision-making lies in the global North. And it's a challenge. And we see ourselves as being responsible for actively shifting power. And I'm happy to talk about that later in the discussion. But one of the recommendations that jumped out for me was we can't all just talk about shifting power as if it's a sort of abstract thing, a sort of hashtag somewhere in the social media landscape. We've all got to own it, and wherever we are in the system, really be conscious of that responsibility to shift power. And finally, just especially for donors, it stood out for me this idea that donors themselves have a lot more than just the resources, the financial resources they provide. And, there's the responsibility to advocate, champion, share platforms, open doors, do all of that other value add stuff that those with money, profile, power, privilege, access have, that they could be doing and using better, perhaps, in support of the organizations they're supporting and the activists they're supporting. And I'll just conclude with one quote, again, which I suspect will be familiar with, or the sentiment will be familiar with for many of you on the call. Feminism is about challenging power. You can't be a grant maker in the gender field if you're not aware of the power dynamics and you're not making efforts to try to at least mitigate them, but hopefully, I suppose, fundamentally change them. So thank you, Katerina. I'm going to stop there and hand back to you.
Brilliant, thank you. That was a really pithy summary of what was a dense and very intensely full of information report. So thank you. I wanted to actually start by asking you if because you've got vast years of experience in the field, what was missing? Was there anything unexpected in the report? Did anything jump out at you as, well, I didn't know that, or I hadn't thought about that before? Or did you think, well, why didn't they delve deeper into, I don't know, something else? Is there anything that you thought was missing or was unexpected or surprising?
That's a great question. I think that the thing that I have hoped for, not just in this research, but in a lot of other sort of efforts to try to understand these issues, is it'd be great to have more of those sort of difficult conversations where you have, say, donor and grantee in the same conversation. So a lot of these researchers, and this one included, often we end up going and talking to a bunch of donors and then talking to a bunch of grantees, and then we sort of try to, whereas I spent 6 years at Civicus, the civil society association, and some of the most useful conversations were where we had a retreat once, for example, where we did bring together Southern civil society activists with Northern donors, and we spent 3 days together. And it was probably the most profound 3 days I've had in many years, because once you start to get into those sort of conversations and someone says, oh, you know, a Southern civil society activist says to Northern donor, why do you insist on those forms? And the Northern donor says, because I'm subject to a parliament who insists. I said, well, haven't you thought about doing that better or doing it this way? Or, that other country does it a different way. And you think, oh yeah. And the sort of penny drops and you think, so maybe it's a sort of next stage of research like this, or maybe others are doing it already, but it would be great to have that sort of, now what? And the sort of bilateral or the courageous conversation, I suppose, between donors and others. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to turn to Angelica. Angelica works at SVRI, which is a research body that focuses on researching violence against women and girls. And it's in an interesting space because it's a grant seeker for its own organisation, but it's also a grant maker to other research bodies. And the report really talks about the lack of funding as its basis available to women's rights and feminist organisations. And honestly, this is a topic that's been lifted up in multiple reports. I mean, seriously, we've been talking about this for such a long time, a couple of decades actually, at least. I've been in the field for like 3 decades. We've been talking about it. Sorry, I'm so old. We've been talking about it since the dinosaurs. So given, Danny mentioned in his intro that, there's been multiple pledges to funding women's organisations. We know the benefits. You also spoke across the board about what the benefits are for funding women's rights and organisations. So I want to ask Angelica, as someone who works in the research world, why do you think there's still such a deep resistance to funding the very groups that are researching women's experiences and how to go about positive creative change?
Thank you so much, Katharina. Great question. And exactly, I was thinking the same as you. I've been talking about this for such a long time. I was just yesterday reading a report from AWICH from the 2005 conference in Thailand. How does change happen? So we know it's messy, we know it's difficult, it's not like a log frame. What is going on? So I think, first of all, to me, and coming from the South, I think there is a key thing about how do we conceptualize, let me be careful, like development or whatever words we want to use, but I think there's a lot of kind of still very colonial approaches to this space. So we have the North kind of feeling sorry for the South, kind of doing charity, sort of, and what does that mean to me? So it's becoming a very technocratic thing, kind of, it's then you as a women's rights organization or as a civil society organization, you either are able to, so they trust whoever can follow the rules, who can follow the rules, so then it's kind of you pass all these barriers and then becomes an incredibly technocratic exercise. And we have all been there, it's the theory of change, the log frame, the M&E things, it's just incredible, it's like, and it can be useful at time, but change is very messy. Change is difficult, unexpected, messy, so you cannot predict with a log frame, obviously. So I think it's becoming clearly a technocratic space. So obviously, the more kind of, the more, let's say, professional, I hate that word, but NGOs can do that. Other ones cannot. So that's one thing. So who they trust, and I hate to put, I'm speaking now the they and us language, but at this point in time, I think we are still in that space, sorry to say. So who they trust, some of these funders, so whoever can play with the game. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think, and it's also the reason they will tell many times is the accountability issue, kind of, so it's this money is from the taxpayers' money from whatever country, whatever in the world you are. I don't want to now. So this the accountability issue. But I think the problem with that too, it has to do with kind of it's the way they conceptualize against development and cooperation. Is not a partnership anymore. It's like, this is my money, and I need to explain to these people how we use it, kind of, and it has become very much also the discourse, I think, right-wing governments to very, very kind of conservative governments, basically, that they don't want to talk, they might talk partnership in international platforms, but when it comes to the reality, they don't operate in that way. Actually, it's very much, this is my money, tell me what you're doing with it. And it's this almost this, you feel this assumption that we are all corrupt here, kind of, so it's like, we are going to misuse this money. So we have to just justify whatever they tell you, all these forms we have to fill in. So that's one thing. Another thing also is the issue about it happens a lot in when you transition from, authoritarian regimes kind of to democracy. And I've seen it in Chile, where I come from, and in South Africa. Immediately, monies that were given to civil society and was quite kind of, in a very quite kind of a generous and very kind of unrestricted way, suddenly goes to government. And then civil society gets forgotten. So somehow all that work we did, it gets forgotten and all monies go to government. With all they tell you apply to government with the monies. And we know it's very difficult, and the role of civil society is very particular. So I think there always should be resources available for the work of civil society. Then years later, these funders realize, oh, okay, the government is not doing what they said they were doing. So then go back to civil society, the advocacy role of civil society, and what we need to do with the resources we need to advocate for implementation of the rights that they were kind of easily passed in constitution and laws, but they're not being realized actually. So then it comes back. So I think there is a bit of like this tendency to now we democratize this space, move the money to the government. And the last one to me is also ideological issue. Many women's rights organization movements are very alive with very progressive movements who are questioning the extreme neoliberal policies, kind of extreme, what is going on with climate change, for instance. So these movements are allied with this very progressive movement. So of course, whoever doesn't want the boat to be rocked, is not going to give money to these organizations. It also has to do with they start kind of taking more. So this is too disruptive. This is too revolutionary in a way. This women's movement is too kind of feminist, far too disruptive in the economic space. So we cannot support that, So then it ends up giving money to projects which are very much kind of very, and I don't want to for a moment say that it's not necessary, but projects which are not rocking the boat. These ones that are kind of very manageable, and they manage to kind of like mold a little bit the organization so they can respond to all the requirements, financial compliance and money. So that's an easy one. So then it looks good in your books if you are a funder kind of saying, look at all the monies we are giving to this country, this region, or whatever. But are they really changing the realities? So I think that's to me some of the reasons, very kind of in a nutshell, kind of at a kind of high level, why is that there's still resistance to provide the right funding for movements and real change.
Thank you. Yes, that's an interesting summary, which does kind of include a lot that's in the report, but takes it in a slightly different direction, which I think is really useful. So collectively, I think you and Danny have summarized some of the barriers, including these complex impact measurement, inflexibility, this huge asymmetry of power. I really liked that, Danny, you said money trickles down, but power doesn't. And then, I mean, Angelica, you also talked about like this women's organizations being so aligned to kind of the revolution, which is what we want to see and what we need, and that being terrifying to those that want to keep the status quo. So I wanted to now turn to Naomi. Naomi holds a position of leadership at a very frontline women's rights organization in Liberia. And I'm lucky because I've had calls with everybody before, so I understand. I have had a conversation, and I know a little bit about how they think. And Naomi spoke very interestingly from her position of leadership at a frontline women's rights organization about how she understands power between the funder and the partner relationship. Danny spoke about how power is held in the global north, and I really wanted to hear from Naomi because she has a really, her experience really speaks to that. Naomi, can you talk to us about how you understand power in that funder-partner relationship?
Thank you, Katerina, and thank you for giving women for affording me the opportunity to just share my lived experience as a women human rights defender and a humanitarian that is on the front line responding to all forms of violence, all forms of crisis every day in our lives. And when it comes to donor, partner, or CSO relation, we see Danny presented very well when I saw in the presentation of Oxfam the unequal power relation. This is something we as local CSOs have struggled with. We are left with only one option. Either you have it or you leave it. The big multilateral institutions that support the work that we do sit at this level of power, and we cannot penetrate it to another level in case we are not in agreement with, in terms of policy, in terms of funding mechanism, in terms of reporting mechanism. We cannot penetrate it. We are left to only discuss with the big multilateral institution, and whether it is against our rights, whether it is against our principle, whether it is against the community that we work for, we cannot penetrate another layer to have answers to our question. So we are left so often with only one solution. This is what the NGOs are bringing to us. This is what we're going to accept. Even in terms of when we report, in terms of our reports, we don't see the final report. In terms of the grant amount, we don't see the ceiling of the grant amount. We are being told that this is what we want you to work with, not what we want to do. Keeping in mind that in the community already, women's rights organizations and women-led organizations are at the very grassroots level responding every day to all forms of crisis, to all forms of humanitarian disaster, before even international or the North come in. Even during the crisis, the women's rights organization on ground responding. Most importantly, after everything settled, the women's rights organization continue to work for the community. But whenever there is a opportunity of funding, there's an opportunity to strengthen the capacity, they are being detected too. They have to receive whatever form of assistance. The agency, the leadership is not recognized. The capacity is not recognized. And we see that this has affected the way of responding over and over. So the way we fund women is to actually recognize women where they are and support them. Big multilateral organizations need to stop telling women's rights organizations how to organize. Because for every time you tell women how to organize, when you leave, you cause more harm to the community. The women groups that organize independently with all your support now depend on you because you have structured them, you have changed their mindset on what it means to respond, and you have left them with any sustainability plan. So I like the report that talks about the flexibility of funding. The flexibility of funding and the way powers trickle down is very interesting. Usually we will see that there are multilateral institutions that have been inserting themselves into space. They say, hey, we are working with women's rights organizations. We are working with feminist-led organizations because they want to have more access to power and wealth. As soon as they have given that opportunity to have more power to work and more power to do the work that they do, when they come on ground, they change. Common example, the grant bagging. Since 2016, big donors, big organizations signed onto the grant bagging just to ensure that 20% of humanitarian fund is directed to local CSO. We still don't have the mechanism that say how many of the funds over the years have been given to CSO. And when you come to women's rights organizations, how many of this funding are directed to women-led organizations that are at the very front line responding? Because when women's rights organizations work, that's something I like that we have a lot of women on the call. It's a natural inclination, especially in the African setting where I live. When we respond to our next door that is on fire, we don't think about our safety. We are there to respond because immediately what is on our mind is to save life. So the unequal power relation in the way funding is being distributed to CSO, specifically women-led organization and women's rights organization, is actually problematic and need to be addressed if we want to save more lives and if we want to shift that power as walking the talk and putting more women at the front line, not only responding, but putting women at decision-making table where the expertise, like capacity is recognized so they can contribute meaningfully so we can save more lives. I just think that the unequal power relation lies on we just walking the talk and deliberately funding women rights organizations where they are so they can be able to amplify the work that they do.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Mhm.
It reminds me of a quote from a colleague called Deegan Ali, who is the CEO of Adesso, and Danny's organization is in partnership with them on a particular piece of work around decolonizing. And she said, we don't need the global north people to do something for us or to us. We need global north organizations to recognize their purposeful neocolonial role in perpetuating an aid system that's about continuing the power dynamics that continue to keep us in poverty and in a position of need. And I think that really reflects exactly what you just said, Naomi. Really, it was very helpful what you said about that sometimes, I think always, the multilaterals are a gatekeeper, and sometimes the INGOs can be gatekeepers that are actually mechanisms that work towards maintaining those power relations. But I know that Danny's organisation is doing quite a lot of work to change that. So perhaps if we have time, we can hear a bit about that later. So thank you, Naomi. I want to, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you one more question, Naomi, because there was a quote in the report that kind of reflected something we had as a conversation. It cites open communication as one of the antidotes to the trust deficit, and quotes one funder as saying, we have such an open relationship with our grantee partners. They tell us everything. I'd just like to hear your reaction to that claim.
I think my reaction is that we are compared to tell everything, but we are not told everything.
Mhm.
We say everything, but we are not told everything.
Right, thank you.
And that's it.
Thank you. When I started in philanthropy 8 years ago, my boss took me aside and she said, as of this day, starting in this job, you are twice as good looking as you were yesterday, 3 times as clever, and 4 times funnier. And I think that when I read that quote, I actually burst out laughing because I thought that person didn't get that pep talk when they started in philanthropy and don't really know what's happening. Can I turn to you now, Maggie? When we had our conversation, you actually had some really brilliant examples of where you've been able to create a different power dynamic with your funders and partners. And I mean, Danny noted down this idea that money can trickle down, but power doesn't. But I think you had some good examples of INGOs who are funders and fundraisers helping to dismantle those barriers, or having a role where you've helped to either change that power dynamic or encourage a different way of resourcing the work that you're doing. So can you share some of that with us?
Yeah, absolutely, Katerina. So I feel now, Malot Tapang, our organisation, we're child protection organisation in southern Cambodia, and I've been involved from the beginning. So I've actually been involved for nearly 20 years. So you can imagine the different types of funders and donors that we've been working with over that time, from when we were very immature and inexperienced to now where we've obviously gained a lot more knowledge. And I think I can honestly say that now we're working with around 5,000 children and around 3,000 families every year. And I can honestly say, if we had remained with those donors, those funders that felt the power was with them because they owned the money, they chose who had it, they owned the knowledge, they felt they owned the knowledge and expertise. If we had remained working with them, we certainly would not be working with 5,000-6,000 children every year. And the reason we have had that positive growth is because of the really, what my team call the good donors. And the good donors are the ones that listen. You know, the good donors are the ones that we can basically have a very honest conversation. We will be honest completely with those ones. We'll be honest about mistakes, or we'll be honest about things that went wrong in our teams. And then we have this trust, you know, and, you know, without being negative, it just is impossible to have that relationship with the donors that believe the power is held by them. because what I've learned and what our teams have learned is they genuinely believe that their ideas and their expertise can be plucked out of their country and dropped into our setting, and they think it will still work, and it just doesn't. And they think that they can, provide us funds, and we should be, eternally grateful, and we should accept those funds on their terms only, a little bit like they're playing the tune and we have to dance to it. Well, we don't, and we mustn't, and we won't, and what we've been very lucky is because we have these other organizations, we've had these experiences that are very negative, and we've shared that with the good organizations we've worked with. We've been honest, we're struggling with this, we don't agree with it, it's not ethical, and most importantly, it's making us less efficient. We want our funders and donors to make us more efficient, provide better services to more people in a more efficient way. Why would we be accepting funds from someone that makes us more bureaucratic, slower, and less agile? So I think when we have experienced the negatives, we use that to our advantage, and we were able to lean on the good donors, as my team describes them as, and share that. And what happened, Katerina, is they stepped up, and we would have quite a few organizations, funding organizations for other countries that did give us, our funding wasn't flexible. It was kind of year to year, although they kept renewing it. It was restricted, and I have had at least 6 or 7 quite large organizations that changed because of what we shared with them. And they said, core funding, flexible funding, unrestricted, that works for you better. And they've said to me, where your money is best spent, where the needs are. And I think that won't happen immediately. It's not going to happen the first year you're working with a funder. But once you've worked together side by side, year after year, that trust and honesty, builds, and they realize that they can be more effective and help us get the positive change that they want and we want. They help us get there faster by giving us this flexible multi-year unrestricted funding. And I feel like there's the positive of that, Katerina, is there's a knock-on effect. They talk to each other. We say, this donor's done that. They feel like, it seems safe to do that these days. You can have this trusting relationship. You can just have more time together as you're monitoring, spend more time together, listen. And I think what's lost with those larger funding organizations is they never tried to listen. And because they didn't try to listen, they didn't learn from us or from all of our partners. They don't learn. And when they don't learn, they don't have the knowledge and expertise they believe to have. They think they've got it right, but they don't have it. So then, to be honest, they get left behind, because they think they know how they can change all these issues in Cambodia or in Africa or wherever, but actually they're losing their knowledge, they're getting left behind. And these wonderful, supportive, multi-year, close partners that we're working with instead, they're the ones that are excelling. They're the ones that are helping with the positive change, and they're part of it. It's mutual. So I mean, it's taken us years, Katerina, to get to this stage where things are a lot more comfortable. Trust me, we've been through lots of very stressful, traumatic situations with those power donors. But I feel like, we rode the wave, and now things have got easier. And that, like I said, this knock-on effect of donors talking to donors and feeling more comfortable with more simplistic things, trust, honesty, spending time together. An impact evaluation can be the story of a child's change of life over a 5-year period, rather than complex log frames with ridiculous amount of data split into age groups and everything. I think they've learned too, it's more effective for them, and those power hungry ones have sort of got left behind.
I love this idea of kind of setting up donor competition, because I've been trying to listen to, but what are the antidotes? And kind of one of them seems to be communication, but what does that actually mean? And part of what, if I understand correctly, part of what you've just said is that communication is also about explaining to donors where they're gonna miss out on something. And there is a lot of, it's true that actually amongst philanthropy, I'll let you in on a secret, there's a huge amount of competition. We always want to be the best, right? And if we hear that funder is better than us, we get really like a bit, argy-bargy about it, and how can we change? So I love this idea about, communicating to a funder that they're the one who's going to be left behind and they're the one who's going to miss out, because that actually speaks to us in a way I don't think others understand. But I just want to move on a little bit to talk exactly about a bit more about what you spoke about, Maggie, this concept that quality funding has three elements: long-term, meaning not that you renew every year, but that you give upfront long-term. Funding core work, which you also said, Maggie, and then the flexibility of it. So I just wanted to come back to you, Danny, because you sit in this interesting space of being a fundraiser, a fund seeker, and a really successful fund seeker. I mean, Oxfam's one of the most successful fundraisers, really. And then as a funder to smaller organizations. So you can see it from both sides. So what do you think it is that stops funders from funding with these three pillars in place: the flexibility, the core, and the long term?
Before I get to that, though, can I just come back to something you were talking about earlier? And I think Angelica also raised it really powerfully for me, which is, before we even get to the funding mechanisms or modalities, there is a question around the sort of the motivation or the ethos of the donor, right? And you called it, I think, Angelica, sort of the savior approach or whatever else it is. And Katerina, you said at the start, we've been talking about this for decades, because when you said that, it reminded me of the quote that's often ascribed to Lilla Watson, the Aboriginal Australian Indigenous artist and activist, who apparently in 1985, at the UN Decade of Women conference in Nairobi, said to the plenary, if you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're here because your liberation is bound up with my liberation, then let's work together. And to me, that, that's the 30 odd years later, it's the most powerful framing for what good philanthropy surely must be like, right? And yet, I keep encountering, like, there are new philanthropies being set up which are all about helping and saviorism, and don't recognize that, even by rich philanthropists whose liberation we need to be talking about or helping them with, right? So I think that before we even get to the modalities, there's something around the starting point, and maybe we need a race to the top, as you say, Katerina. There needs to be a competition where you're all challenging each other as donors or philanthropists around, how you are living up to that sort of challenge that Lilla Watson and others have made. Do you want me to pause there, or shall I go on to answer your actual question?
No, as you like, please. Unless anyone else wants to comment on that. Does anyone, Naomi, do you want to jump in on that? The comment about the collective liberation?
Yes, the collective liberation. So Liberia had a 14-year civil crisis. And I just want to piggyback on that. And when we saw the UN troop into our country, the white savior syndrome set in, and we felt that these people were here to liberate us and save us. But at the end of the day, currently we are having a lot of negative effects about that whole mission. There are a lot of children who have been abandoned. There are a lot of rape cases that happen. The increase of sexual gender-based violence was at another level. There was a complete mechanism put in place to actually capture sexual exploitation and abuse. So we saw that the whole white savior syndrome that we see, especially those of us that are in sub-Saharan Africa, affect our own community. And how do we dismantle and challenge that? Is that power that needs to be shifted to us in understanding people movement, their roles, their responsibility. Whenever we see humanitarian groups go into the country, they should be given the responsibility to actually do. I like the whole thing about the whole safeguarding thing right now. But before safeguarding, we saw how many damages that happened, how many negative impact that these response left in communities. So now we have to actually shift that power in a way that during humanitarian crisis, those who are already victims should also understand that understand the rights, understand the roles and responsibility of peacekeeper or even humanitarian frontline responder. I think it's that whole access to knowledge and understanding where you sit is where give that influence of white savior syndrome.
Right, yeah, thank you very much. I think also those moments of challenge can be levers for really dramatic change. I don't want to put any words into Danny's mouth, but I saw that that deep crisis that Oxfam experienced a couple of years ago around exploitation and abuse in their work is, I think, what led to a very, very different approach by Oxfam to their place in the humanitarian and development world. I think, sorry if I'm making terrible judgments, but I think very much prior to that, even under the leadership of a woman of colour, there was this very strong idea that Oxfam was part of that. We're going to come in and be the solution. And I think that unfortunate and really horrifying events actually became kind of part of the drive to be a very different player. And so, I mean, it's not to say out of terrible things come good things, because I'm not a believer of that at all. Terrible things create terrible outcomes. But I do think that there are moments that create this reflection. And it would be great if there was a moment of reflection, if we can go back to this idea around what funding could look like differently if we wanted to put power into the hands of these organisations that are creating the change. And go back to you, Danny, about, you know, where do you think is the moment, or as a funder and someone who funds smaller organisations, what do you think could be that moment that might bring about this dramatic change so we do start funding in this way that organisations have been calling for a long time?
I mean, I think you are right, Katerina, around the importance of our sort of the failures on safeguarding for Oxfam created the space, the momentum, the pressure for us to have a much deeper conversation that colleagues and feminists and critics had been saying about our sector for a long time. But for Oxfam, it made us have a longer conversation about, a deeper conversation about power, not just power and the abuse of it in the sexual misconduct context, but really about how power works within our own system. So we did a bunch of things, and Katerina, you were involved in one of those initiatives, but we did a sort of collective analysis of our own sort of culture and the assumptions we make. And there are all sorts of things, you know, we are here to help is one of the sort of founding principles of the sort of Oxfam psyche. Another one is we know best. And so we've spent a lot of the last 3 years trying to understand and address some of those cultural assumptions. But the funding equation is fascinating because where that led us to is the realization that ultimately, I suspect all of us on this call are fundermediaries of some sort, right? We are intermediaries who are in some sort, when you're looking at the financial piece of it, I'm not saying that's the only piece, but we're all transacting and we're all charging overheads or being extractive, depending on the way you want to say it. And I'm not saying that's always bad, because overhead can be good. I think we also need to celebrate overheads in our sector better, but because overheads allow us that sort of, you know, the reflection, the time to reflect and do all sort of other stuff. But when we ran the numbers within the Oxfam system, we were shocked at ultimately how much resource, in this case, financial resource, still sat in the global north, even in our own global structures. And there's no international benchmarking, by the way, and that's another thing that perhaps we should do better at, which is, you know, for the sake of transparency, at least within the our own respective sectors, start to share what these numbers look like within our own structures. And so we've made internal commitments to say that we will shift power even within our system, so that a good example is in our structure, we have a sort of affiliate system where there are 20 or so legal entities, which are mostly in the global north, but increasingly in the south as well. And then there are 50 or 60 country offices, and then they work with local partners. But if you look at the sort of chain of transactions, by the time that, you know, the funding gets to our local partners, it's chunked up into tiny little grants, often with high conditions. And so we've said, okay, we're going to flip that and say, our responsibility as the sort of northern fund intermediary is to collect money as well as we can, and we'll try to raise resources here in the UK and elsewhere, but then move it as efficiently and as empoweringly through that system as possible, so that my colleagues who are in country teams have the core flexible long-term resources that they can use, and that they themselves can also identify and work alongside partners. And for me, and I'm sure colleagues on the call will have lots of examples of this. This was so clear because before I started at Oxfam, I knew I was coming to Oxfam, and I had the chance to go and visit Oxfam in Zimbabwe and met some amazing activists, including the head of the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe, who many of you probably work with. And Oxfam has been involved with funding the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe for all of its 20 years or so of existence. In fact, we're one of the early funders of it. But I heard from the director that rather frustratingly, every one of those years that we funded the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe has been through an annual grant. I think so. Why does this international NGO with hundreds of millions of pounds of resource, why does it need to fund an organization on an annual basis with presumably with paperwork every year? And we've been funding it for all of its existence. And I'm thinking, it's like, that's crazy. And so those are the sorts of things that we're trying to change. And we've created a new community fund for women's organizations, so that, again, country leadership teams can identify long-term partnerships and give, in this case, in the first instance, it'll be 3-year-long partnership agreements, which will involve, relatively small, $20,000 or so a year worth of core funding to local partners. But the starting point, in some ways, is twofold. One is that cultural piece you were talking about, Katerina, where we had the sort of burning platform, if you want to use that phrase. It's not a great phrase, that drove the impetus for change. And then we decided to change the mechanics of it. And it comes at cost, because we've had to take some painful decisions about taking resource and capacity out of the global north. We've had redundancies in the British bits of Oxfam. But it was a conscious decision that we can and have to do better at moving resources in that flexible long-term way that we were talking about. Thanks.
Brilliant.
Sorry, Katerina, can I just quickly, because that's really kind of very, I absolutely agree with, Danny. And I just, again, we are in the same position as sort of middle women. So it's a kind of passing resources. I think to me also is very important, what I have seen it happening also with some middle-sized, big-size NGOs also in the South, where they become clearinghouses for resources. And instead of becoming advocates for the grassroots level organizations who will get the money, they become the controllers of the money from whatever organization, big donor is there. So it's also changing when you are in kind of in between, let's say, just to realize you have power, and instead of having the power to kind of push down the whatever rules and all that, is the other way around. You have the power to talk to this big donor or sitting whatever to say, let's make this easier, or give me the power, trust me to make the life of these organizations easier, And I think that's also how you are said, again, like Oxfam case is much bigger than SBRI, definitely, but we can play that role, advocates for passing the money. It's not the opposite, not being the controllers on behalf of whoever, because the divisions too that causes in the regions or in country is enormous. And we have all seen it, this bigger NGO who has got now the money to pass to the other ones. So it's terrible that it becomes very perverse competition to be in the good eyes of these more powerful NGOs. So it's a very dangerous game too. And I think we shouldn't play into that game. We are sitting here, we know what's going on. Trust me, if you're passing the monies for me to provide for research or movements, trust me, we will be transparent in the way to we do a call for application selection. So you don't need to be I don't need to be giving you kind of explanations about every single cent spent, I think that to me is very important, how we see whoever kind of clearinghouses, so kind of in betweeners we have it. And I think we are added we are in the research space, but promoting research in low and middle income countries. And again, like you were saying, a lot of the money is for research, particularly sitting in high income countries in the global north. So we are saying we have such a need in the South. Why cannot we provide more resources here and make it easier for researchers to access that? And again, what I like also a lot is that we are not just giving money to researchers like one researcher, we give to organizations and consortiums. And I'm super happy we are going through a now round of about to allocate, and the lead in the consortium many times is women's rights organizations who want to do research. They partner with researchers. So it's not about also giving just to their, it's how you also promote consortium that can really empower also women's rights organizations on the ground. So I think that's another way to, when we talk about women to research, it's not about researchers and the academia. It's not about that either. So anyway, just that on the role we could play as a kind of in the middle.
Atalante?
Yeah, so there are a few things in the chat, and a lot of people agreeing with the way I'm going forward. There's one question from Alexandra, which may be a good question to pose now. How do you approach donors without seeming accusatory, but rather seeking constructive dialogue, asking donors to self-liberate and to commit to equitable motivations and funding? Fund dispersion seems like it would prevent it could prevent resources.
Can I ask Maggie to answer that?
Hi,
Yeah, I think Maggie's the best. Yeah.
I think, again, as I said earlier, when we're approaching donors, it's just so important that we've got that trust between them. So when it's a new donor, of course, that's more complex, but you haven't got your history together. You haven't worked side by side for some time. But I think when we have already built trust with donors and they feel safe with us and we feel safe with them, I think it's very appropriate to have those conversations. I think it's no one's offended. It's a safe setting. You can express how you feel. That doesn't mean that we're pushing them away or they're pushing us away. It's like trying to have a mutual conversation where both sides are well respected. And that's when you start to get somewhere. And again, you can only do that with the right type of donors. I mean, there will be we've learned there's groups of donors that we've just learned to not work with. Unfortunately, we've tried to advocate and change the way that they work with us, and it's just sometimes not possible. And rather than drain our resources and lose sleep at night and have our teams stressed, we've just made decisions that they're not the right people for us. And I think that's also okay, because we're not right for them, they're not right for us. And I think that's okay. And we're not accusing them of being wrong and terrible. We just say we don't want to work with you. We did have one situation of a big international organization where it was going so badly, and we tried so, really genuinely tried to improve things, to collaborate, to compromise. And when it was going so badly, we just decided ourselves, it's very unusual in Cambodia, just to not sign the year 2 contract with them. It caused there was a huge ripple effect. They'd never had that happen before. They weren't used to, the beneficiary saying no to the donor. But that had some positive ripple effects as well, because other partners say, hang on, we don't have to put up with this either. So we weren't accusing them of being wrong. We weren't demanding they did it a different way. We tried to work it out. We did our best to try and compromise, and we couldn't get anywhere, So I think it's fine to accept that we try and change the outlook that some of them have, and sometimes we can't. So let's just leave it at that and go, partner with other people,
I think that's a really important point. I also think that there's some organizations whose financial stability is so precarious that the idea of turning down money takes a level of bravery that goes well beyond just a personal or organizational statement about what we're prepared to put up with, but also whether or not the program participants will get the services they need. So I completely understand what you're saying. On the other hand, I will tell you from a donor's perspective that when that happens to us and we have a potential partner knock us back, it actually really affects how we feel. It's ridiculous how we feel. Who cares how we feel? But also it does make us think about, well, wait a second, are we doing something wrong if a potential partner is prepared to turn us away? So it does have a powerful impact. But I do also recognize there's plenty of partners who just financially can't really.
Absolutely. And even though we were able to, because of all our very good ones, I was still in a very uncomfortable position because I had to talk to all our funding partners and disclose this, because we didn't want people to start thinking, oh, how arrogant of them, or do they have too much money? Are they turning down money for the people in the community, the children, the women? That wasn't the case. We worked it out, and we thought, if we stop working with this donor, there will not be one single child or woman that has any they'll never know. It makes no difference to services. Otherwise, of course, we wouldn't have been able to do that. If we hadn't had other sources of funding, we would have been stuck, like you say. Do we continue to take this difficult funding just to keep the services going, or do we say no, but then we're going to impact the communities that we're serving? So it is really complex, we were very fortunate.
I think Naomi wants to jump in because she has an experience of this.
Yeah, so I just listening to Maggie, I'm laughing. I'm like, when will we as CSO, especially in Liberia, have that opportunity to say no? Because obviously the flexibility or the donor or the NGOs that are specifically working with women's rights organizations are just less than 2% here. So the few that we have to work along with us, we continue to take whatever they give us. And it's so unacceptable, because more often it's not only about us as individuals, it's how do we run our organization. The beneficiaries in the community, the women group, the movement that rely on us, how do we let them down if we're going to hold on to our principles? And this is something that continues to kill us. So it comes back with the uneven, equal power religion. Who do you actually seek another alternative from? Like, if I don't go for this, who else going to help me? And one of the things that is actually happening, specifically to Liberia and other West African countries, is that whenever you have to challenge one donor, for instance, like, what is your principle in terms of your feminist values, or your principle in terms of your commitment to the grand bargain, they try to blackball you. They try to label you. And once you start to be labeled, the people in the donor community communicate. They communicate to protect themselves, not to protect you. So when they communicate and they feel that you are challenging, you are trying to dismantle, and you are demanding the change, they are going to block you from entering spaces. So that's what we're saying. If you have flexible funding, you won't care if one donor is blocking you, because you have 3 to 4 years operation, and you can use that to actually push for the change that you want. But you are looking that you only have 6 months funding, and after 6 months, what next? You need to talk to the same people that you just challenged to support you. So then you are put in this cube that you cannot move, and it's so unacceptable, it's so depressing, but you continue to go every day and face the same thing. So I just wanted to say that engaging donor that we don't talk to is challenging for us. And Maggie, I'm happy that you can talk to donors, but we can't.
But Naomi, don't lose hope.
Before you Atalante, Angelica had a point I wanted to hear.
I just wanted, I think it's, the issue of how to kind of have an open relationship. I think that's what's becoming a lot, up now, between donors and partners. I remember years ago, we had something quite interesting, and maybe could be replicated somehow. We had in South Africa, just after democracy, again, a lot of donors coming to the country and how to manage the relationship with civil society, with the government. And they used something called the donor networks on women, used to be called. The interesting thing was all the donors, really everyone was sitting there, donors were kind of engaging on a regular basis with civil society. So we had, and that kind of was basically, that initiative was supported by a donor who really wanted to keep on the communication open about who is funding what needs what. And I think it was a very good space to kind of, challenge kind of from the civil society side, to challenge the donors in a same room, say, what are you doing here? Why are you putting so much money in this and not into that? Look what's going on. It was an incredibly, it ran for a few years. It was a very good space, actually. So it's something that maybe one could think of, at national level, maybe it could be, but again, very representative of every donor. And I think the power also of being together, not one NGO fighting with all the donors, potential donors, like all of us, we were together talking to the donors, questioning them. What are you doing? What are you doing? And I think that's very, from accountability point of view, is very good exercise, because a bit like the competition, we also could say, and we became all friends, and they're like, you are great, you're not so great, look what you are doing, So I think it's they start feeling bad about what they are doing, and somehow we were able to influence the way they were dispersing funds. So it's something that we could start to think about, you know, in maybe national level. I think national level is the ideal somehow.
Hey, Danny, I saw your hand.
Yeah, just to I suppose reinforce the points that are being made. It's unlikely that these really frank conversations are going to happen at the sort of retail level, right? Because if you as a donor, Katerina, ask your grantee about how you're doing, you're going to be told how beautiful you are and how funny you are and all of those things that you are regularly told, right? But it has to be, therefore, I think, something around sort of safety in numbers or wholesale, if you will. And, you know, that's maybe where networks like Giving Women can play a really useful role, where, you know, you can convene those frank conversations or courageous conversations where it's not about the actual bilateral relationship, but, you know, sector by sector. Certainly think naming and faming works. When I was at Civicus, we launched these things called the Brave Philanthropy Awards. And it won't surprise you that a lot of the nominees were involved in women's rights, because inevitably that's where a lot of bravery is seen. And it was really useful to name and fame, but we were pushed back and asked why at Civicus we weren't naming and we were naming and faming. We were asked, why weren't we naming and shaving? Why weren't we doing a sort of stupid philanthropy award? But we didn't, but maybe someone needs to do that. And the other thing is around sort of, you know, some sort of collective standards around feedback loops, because it's not good enough to just sort of ask your grantees and they keep telling you. I saw this firsthand soon after I started. I went to the DRC with colleagues and met a bunch of local partners who were brought into a hotel room. And, you know, we had a very good conversation over an hour about how wonderful Oxfam was. And I thought something's not quite right. So I passed around a Post-it note and said to the partners in the room, can you please score us from 0 to 10 on how good a partner you really think we are? And we got lots of 4s, 5s, 6s. And then we began the really honest conversation about how we could be doing better and we have to be doing better. And it just was a clear example of, we don't even have the feedback loops to get the honest feedback here. And yet, you know, in other sectors of the world, in the commercial world or in the tech world, this stuff is being done, you know, where they're leapfrogging us. And in the social change sector, we're going to be left behind unless we get much better at the accountability, the accountability revolution, if you will. Thanks.
Yeah, or the feedback revolution, because I think the two are deeply linked. And if we understood as donors feedback as a way of improving the outcomes that we need to report on, as opposed to a kind of policing mechanism, which is how it's currently seen, I think, you know, it would be a lot easier to get us on board as well. Atalante, are you desperately?
Yeah, there's a question here that really is quite, it's a good segue, and it's from Rebecca Jorgensen, and she says, one ongoing and growing problem is the focus of assessors like Charity Navigator to tell donors the value of women's NGOs, encourage and discourage support, because they push towards empirical assessment versus qualitative or normative approaches. They often undervalue the actual systemic success of the later approaches. Is there a way as a group to put pressure on these increasingly powerful groups to modify or evolve their assessment mechanism, etc.? So I think it's quite a good follow-on from what we're discussing.
Absolutely brilliant, and thank you so much, because that is actually the next set of questions that we were going to go to. So does anybody from the panel want to talk about that? Naomi, you had some good thoughts about assessments and monitoring and so forth.
Yeah, one of the things that we have had in terms of how do we report in terms of the assessment that happened to the work that we do. Most of the donor is looking for, we have 5 workshops, we have 20 women, we have 30 women. These are not the change that happen in the community. The actual change that happen in the community is not the people that attend the workshop. The actual change that happen in the community is when the community mindset begin to change. When we see a well-being community, a community that is inclusive of all. And most often, donor is waiting, they are waiting to see that you have 5 workshops and how did you spend the money on the 5 workshops. The meetings that change the community most often happen in the night. It happens in religious places. It happens in traditional places that they are not conformed to signing papers and they don't even want to be documented. But what we want in the community is a healthy community. So how do we measure change in community? It's very critical. And this change, this mindset, this way of reporting can change when we actually start to include grassroots engagement, not the standard nothing paperwork that you have to fill. What does change mean for the community that you want to impact? I gave you an example of about Ebola. When Ebola hit Liberia, everybody, the newspaper, the news said that everybody in Liberia were headed for a place of death, that we were dying. The virus were contagious and we were dying. And there was enough, there was all of the humanitarian groups were coming to Liberia. I can tell you, when the community people realized that they were going to die, when the young people in the community realized that they have to help the community to have a healthy community, that was what stopped Ebola. Not the aid that came to Liberia, not the people that came with all the expertise stopped the spread of Ebola. So it's that mindset. How are we measuring mindset and change community? And one of the things I told Katerina when we talked on was the issue of FGM. I work in community where you are not allowed to talk about FGM 4 years ago. It took us 4 years to this year that now we have the community themselves saying that FGM going to be bound in the community. Not UN funding, not our NGO funding. It was the work that have been done over the years with change in mindset, the human rights-based approach, how people should be able to make informed decisions, the violation, how it affects women. Those community, the people in the community learn and unlearn and decided to take visible action. But most funny were one in 2 years, the one within 2 years, what happened within 4 years, they want just a year. You should be able to give report that this happened. If people are giving you report that these are the changes that are happening in community, they are lying. Change takes time. Change are not events, it's processes. So that's why we're pushing for multi-year partnership. When we partner with the community and the community take ownership of the issues that we're working along with them, we're gonna see change, but not within a year or two. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to go to Maggie because, I mean, the question was actually about how can we collectively advocate for different mechanisms or different ways of measuring. And you've got a little bit of experience of working collectively in Cambodia.
Yeah. Firstly, I just want to say, Naomi, I totally understand and empathize with everything you say, because we were in a situation you were in 10 years ago where we wouldn't be able to turn down funds, and we did have to push ourselves to go in every day and manage what you're managing. So don't lose hope, you know, because when we what we've done in Cambodia, we have a network of similar, like-minded, really the similar values more than anything. So similar values in our work, working in child protection, all over the country, you know, in different provinces. We don't all receive funding from the same sources, but we did join together to work together. So it wasn't about funding, it was just working together, referring cases to each other, you know, child protection cases. If someone's an expert on working with drugs and alcohol, then we would share our experience with someone. And then if they were lacking skill in, say, reintegrating children back to family, we could learn from each other. It was all about learning. But as we developed, we've been doing this for 10 years, there's 11 partners. We did start to advocate together, but with donors too. And we actually started to receive funds from actually UNICEF. So this isn't the easiest funding source, you know. And because we were a coalition together, our voices were so much louder. And, you know, they had to listen to us a lot more. It wasn't just one organization being a bit difficult and maybe being blacklisted, like Naomi was saying. When there's 11 organizations saying together, hang on a minute, we need to talk about this, we need to do this in a better way. What you're proposing wouldn't work in this setting. Can you listen to the grassroots organizations? We do have the knowledge, we can share it. Because I think what often happens, you know, with some coalitions is they're always led by an international consultant, and they'll have a gesture of touching base with the local NGO leaders. But what we love about this sort of coalition network we've got, it isn't the funding's coming from a, you know, international source, but the voices are all local Cambodian leaders, you know, so there isn't this kind of colonialist white consultant sent in from other countries dropping their ideas on Cambodia. It wouldn't work anyway. That doesn't exist. And we've been able to, as a group together, and like I said, it's been going for 10 years. Sometimes it's really hard work, you know, because you're working in partnership. You know, sometimes we don't agree with the same ideas, and, you know, it goes back and forth, but collectively we feel so supported by each other. We lean on each other, and then we have a bigger voice to the donor as well. Now that group, that network, we, like I said, we only apply for funds together on certain things. You know, it's not like all our funding comes from this, but we've just learned it's just such an advocacy group, such a strengths-based group, leaning on each other, propping each other up at difficult times, and it can happen. You know, it can happen. It really doesn't cost us anything to lean on each other at difficult times and to share knowledge. You know, it just takes time to put in a bit of effort, because partnership takes effort, right? But when you've got the right people, the right partners, the same values, the same beliefs, the same advocacy, fight and justice in them that we have, it works beautifully, you know.
Thanks, Maggie. Atalanta, I have a few further questions, but I really think it's better, since we only have 6 minutes, 7 minutes.
Yeah, so I think Leo has collected all the questions. Leo, would you
be able to tell us, you know, maybe the top one, and we can let everybody...
Yes, Leo, you there? It's been very active. We have a question from Dev TV. They are the group.
Hear you, Leo, for some reason.
We lost Leo. Yeah.
No, she's there. We can't hear you.
Yeah, Leo, we can't hear you.
Well, maybe one of you, Kathleen.
Yeah, I can do it. Yeah, there's one question here from Dev TV, from Tifen. And she said, our role is to empower our young laureates, support their field projects, and help them develop their fundraising networking skills to boost their impact. What will be your recommendation as donors to seek long-term funding as opposed to punctual project-based donations? I think the conversation has been very much about that. Leo, I think you've made priorities. Have you prioritized the questions?
Yeah, so a lot of questions were answered in the chat. So we had this chat and this question and another question that from Sarah that is asking, is there any mediator group that could help when there are issues or blocks between funders and organizations? And we've seen these two questions kind of come up in different formats. So asking these two questions, what Advanti just said, and a question talking about mediation between funders and organization.
Does anyone want to jump in on that question?
We've always had to deal with it ourselves. We didn't have any mediators to help us, you know.
I would encourage organizations to talk to the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership. I mean, they're not a mediating body, but part of their function is about that kind of reciprocal accountability. And so that might be a role that you could encourage them to take up. And certainly I think they have the space in the sense that they're in, but they're not a funder and they're not a recipient in that sense. So they might be able to help with that, or at least point you in a direction. And Danny, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think I suppose back to that point about sector bodies. You know, if you've got in your national context, if there's either a sort of wider civil society group or a women's rights association or feminist network, that might help, or globally, you know, the likes of AWID and others might be useful in terms of at least getting advice, if not mediating as such. And on the other point around the sort of long-term, you know, that there's a fundamental mind shift that we all have to make around the sort of the term in which we see the sort of change we're trying to make. And many of these questions and what we talked about, and even in this report, there's that tension between sort of long-term. And the issue, I think, in some ways is best summarized if you say, you know, the reason why, you know, I work at Oxfam Great Britain, a very large and prominent civil society organization that's 80 years old this year. But the only reason we are here and we are this big and prominent is because we had access to core, stable resources for most of our history. And so it seems really naive to think that we're going to build a diverse, resilient, vocal, independent civil society in the places we're working in through short-term project funding that's, you know, only going to measure short-term impact, right? So we've got to flip it to say that the end, you know, creating a diverse, strong, vibrant, vocal, independent civil society, and particularly with women's rights organizations in there, is an end in itself. And therefore, we've got to start thinking about how we nurture that through the sort of funding modalities there. And that mind shift, I think, is, you know, we need to sort of inculcate that in, through donors and others as well.
But I'd like to come in here as well and say that sometimes I think smaller grassroots organizations are almost frightened to request the 3-year funding. They say, well, we'll only ask for a little now. It's almost like we need to also shift the way that the requests are being made, and to say, you've got to be advocates for the fact that if you want this organization and the work that you're doing to have a long-term effect, you've got to ask for all the money you need and for however long you need it. So I think it's, again, that power. We're scared of the power when we're a small organization. And I think that's something, it has to work both sides.
Thanks. I think,
yeah, definitely wanted to support that. I really wanted to support that. And I think there is something we could do also as kind of like your intermediaries sometimes, do more support for smaller organizations on resource mobilization to understand that they have the right, they can ask for more. I think that's some of the work we could do. We did that when I was in another organization working with the network in the continent. Support on that. It's incredible kind of like small skills on resource mobilization that can really help smaller organizations. So don't be afraid, don't be ashamed of asking for more, but that's part of your kind of mindset toward resource mobilization, basically, how you do it properly. So absolutely, I agree with Atalante.
I see we've got 2 minutes, Atalante. So would you like me to sum up some of the things I heard?
Yeah,
would you like another chat? Okay. So first of all, I want to thank everybody. I came into this, I will confess, a little bit kind of skeptical about the report. I said to everybody on the prep call, rocking the boat isn't really enough, and I used some inappropriate swearing that I won't use here. I thought we had to blow the boat up and start again. But I also read this interesting quote while I was preparing for today that said, the system relies on women not rocking the boat, because if we want to maintain what little power we have or women's organisations have, we have to play the game the way it's intended. So then that becomes a big question about what can we collectively do to change the way the system operates to benefit the communities we work for. And it's pretty cool because you all came up with some really good things, some of which were really buried in what you said. So I'm going to try to lift them up, and if I forget anything, I'm going to give you each one last word when I've finished. Normalize making mistakes. Maggie said this in a different way. Use, because that creates trust, use those experiences to your advantage and create a learning moment. I think it was also Maggie who said change is messy and chaotic. So I wonder if there are ways that we can measure chaos and mess. And Naomi said change is about process. How can we measure chaos, mess and process in a way that speaks to funders so they hear that they're part of a big change? We need to minimise the requirements to access funding. So I can't remember who said it, but someone said we need to, maybe it's Danny, shift from a transactional funding model, I would say, to a transformational funding model that values, maybe talked about the work of the organisation equally to the funding that's given to do the work. So recognise the work is the significant contribution in this partnership beyond the funding. I would also say it came out of what Naomi said, she didn't use these words, but recognising that building trust is also an act of collective care. We talk about that a lot in the feminist funding field now, the importance of collective care. And it struck me while you were talking about trust building, that all the elements you need to build trust are actually parts of what we do in collective care work. Communicating, celebrating, recognizing each other's value. They work just as well for building trust as they do for collective care. Good donors listen, understand reciprocity of power, that the expertise lies at the front line. This is what Naomi said, that even if the money comes from the north, the expertise is in the south. I hate that language. And that therefore, I don't want to use the word gratitude, but recognition needs to flow both ways rather than just recognizing financial contribution as value. There's safety in numbers. If you want to step out of bilateral discussions where you feel fearful, then those collective partnerships, Maggie, Angelica, and Danny all talked about the power of the collective partnership. I would say from my perspective that philanthropy has so much privilege that we are able to embrace risk, and that we need you to help us redefine what risk is. Danny talked about shifting power to where the action happens, and that in philanthropy can be considered risky. I would point to other, just in Oak, for example, when we do our risk assessment, this is a secret inside thing, so don't tell anyone I told. Big organizations are considered less risky than small ones. And I'm constantly advocating for the idea that a little woman's organization that gets $70,000 a year is a significantly lower risk than a big organization that accesses huge amounts of money and could totally stuff it up. So, but it's an interesting concept of how we understand risk. And I think it goes back to that collective understanding of how you can help us understand that better. And I would end with a reflection on Danny's earlier quote from Lila Watson about a collective liberation is bound together. And so what I heard collectively from you is that empowering those at the margins in the communities to lead systemic change, that's about investing in the people who reflect the values of the world that we dream of, and invest in them like we want them to win. And I would like to open up to give each of you one final word. So I'm going to start with, just so you know, I'm going to go Angelica, Maggie, Naomi, Danny.
Thanks so much, Katharina. So to me, you know, when I was listening to the word trust, I think it's all over. It's all the time. The trust issue is super important. The issue of change, exactly. How do we measure change in a different way? But I also like what you said about the philanthropy. Philanthropy can afford to be risky, kind of, you know. So why cannot we also, this conversation, move it to beyond the spectrum of the philanthropy donors to funders, to other kind of like the bilateral, the big NGOs, big bilaterals, kind of, they should be thinking about this too. Shouldn't be just for the philanthropy space. So that would be to me something that we can come up this conversation and of, you know, of the advocacy that Giving Women can do, for instance. Let's move beyond just philanthropy. That's from my side. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Maggie.
I would just like to finish by saying, Katharina, I feel hopeful. Talking to everyone, listening to everyone, we've all experienced very similar struggles with this, and it is a big struggle. And you know, yes, it isn't just philanthropists; it's definitely the international organisations. But when we listen to each other at our struggles, and then we listen to what Danny's saying, it makes me feel really hopeful, because if Oxfam, who are a big, large organisation, you know, are leading some of these changes, I mean, this will influence other larger organizations that will start to hopefully be a bit more humble and appreciate the learning comes from the grassroots and the knowledge is held with the communities. And, you know, I know this is a massive change, and like the changes that we have to see in our communities can take 10, 15 years, these mindset changes, like Naomi says, it's so true, it can be 10 years or more to change mindsets. It will be with these donors too. But, you know, the journey has started. So I find that really positive.
Thank you, Maggie. Naomi?
Yeah, thank you all for this good exchange and unlearning process. And I just want to close by saying that this conversation always open mind. It always gave us the space where we can share our lived experience, learn, and see people who are at the front line or who are at that global level trying their best to invest change. But I would say one thing, the more we have these webinars and don't have results, the more change continue to be in webinars and on Zooms and on LinkedIn or whatever meeting. The change we want to see in a couple of years is to have practical examples. It don't have to be Naomi. We need to see women from the front line saying, 5 years ago, I was trusted. This is where my organization stands. And we need to hear from the Chope say, I'm not dealing no more with the big multilateral organization. I have taken the risk. I have tried 2 organizations and it is working. We need practical examples to these webinars. So take the leap of the faith. Philanthropists, global donors, NGOs, the power that is invested at the local level is the change that you want to invest in and you want to bring in community. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dami.
Thank you very much. It was really inspiring and useful conversation with lots of insights. For me, I think that your point about risk just now, Katerina, was spot on. And like, we really need to sort of completely blow up the notion of how we think about risk at the moment. To me, you know, the world is burning out there, and it is ridiculous that we're still talking about the same pledges that we failed to make from decades ago. And all of us in this sort of ecosystem driving towards social change, particularly those of us who work for better resourced or northern or, you know, better off bits of this ecosystem, the biggest risk is that we are making ourselves irrelevant and painting ourselves out of the picture. And I think that, you know, this is the moment where we have to think about what are those things each of us can do so that if we're having this call in 10 years' time, we're not moaning again, as you said, about the lack of progress. And we're saying, what, you know, we want to be able to describe how we helped incubate or nurture the sort of system that we want. And we're not going to get a better opportunity in some ways than with all of the sort of change and disruption that we have in the world to drive towards that. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you all. I've had so much fun, really, learning from you today, and I'm incredibly grateful. And I'm going to hand back to Atalante. I just want to reiterate Naomi's point. The power at the local level is the change we need to invest in. You, Atalante.
Yeah, so inspiring. I think what Naomi ended with is really very much what we believe. This is only the beginning or part of the journey. The value of a webinar like this is to get the people together, exchange ideas, share knowledge, push us outside our comfort zone, and push us to action. So it doesn't end here. And I think the value is that we have been given the equipment and the tools to really implement in the work that we do. So I would like to thank you all for pushing us, for questioning, for challenging, for opening our minds to make real change in the way that we do our work. I would also like to thank, because I didn't thank her earlier, is Lior Ranu, who is a member of Giving Women and who is responsible for putting this incredible panel together. So Lior, a big thank you. And this is something that, you know, Giving Women is an organization where we all work. Everybody has a role. And I hope that we will be able to continue our collaboration. I want to thank our audience who was super engaged. And I hope that we have given you some tools to answer some of the challenges that we all face working with small organizations, working for an improved life for girls and women throughout the world. So a big thank you to everybody, our audience, our panelists, Katerina, and a big thank you to Lior and Kathleen. So to be continued. Maybe we get back in 10 years and see where we are. Thank you very much.
Okay.